Get started just to get started. So welcome everybody, especially those joining by video tonight, to our next installment of this wonderful story that we've got going. Before we get too deep into it, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Most wonderful and gracious Heavenly Father, God, we're just so thankful for the opportunity to be here tonight, to gather in your name, to hear more of your story, Lord, to contemplate our place in that story and what that means for us and for you. God, we just ask that tonight, even though our numbers be small, Lord, that you would grace us with a powerful Holy Spirit movement. God, that we would treasure these words in our heart, Lord, that they would grow up and bear good fruit in our lives. So be with us and guide us as we find our way through your word tonight, and we return all the glory unto you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, well, our number is few. I know Joe already submitted his excuse, signed, sealed, of why he couldn't be here. It has been approved. I don't know where everybody else is, but they're going to miss a great story tonight. Maybe we tell them next Sunday how great the story was they missed.
What chapter are we in?
We're going to be in chapter 5 tonight.
Okay.
Hoping to get through chapter 14. When we last left off, Elijah had... I almost said he died, but he didn't die. He was taken up to heaven, and his protege, Elisha, then got a double portion of his spirit and started carrying on in his death. He started right off doing signs and wonders just like Elijah did. When we jump into the story tonight, we meet a man from Aram. So he's an Aramean, which they are on again, off again, enemies of Israel. They're from the area would be modern day Iran, I believe. So they were in the north part of Israel, and every so often they would get on bad terms with Israel and they'd kind of butt heads or whatever. Well, one of the commanders of the king of Aram, his name was Naaman. He had a bad case of leprosy. I mean, he was a great commander, but he had leprosy. And he struggled with this, I'm guessing, for most of his life. Now, he had an Israelite slave girl. It was his wife's slave. She was an Israelite woman. And this slave girl says, you know what? I'm going to tell you about a man I know. Now, there's a guy, a prophet, a man of God over in Israel, and I bet you that he could probably help you out with that leprosy problem you got. So Naaman, instead of sending somebody to go talk to the prophet, they tend to like to deal with higher ups, right? So he sends a messenger over to, Naaman's boss, which would be the king of the Arameans. He sends a messenger over to Israel's king, along with some gifts and a little letter. And he says, here's the deal. I've got a guy who needs some help. He's got leprosy. We think that maybe y'all can help him. And the king says, I don't know what you expect me to do. I might be a king, but I can't cure leprosy. Elijah hears about it and says, hey, maybe you can't, king, but I think I might be able to do something about it. So why don't you go ahead and just send him on down to me? So Naaman ends up going over to see Elisha, and Elisha sends a messenger out to tell him what to do. So Elisha doesn't even deal with him face to face. He says, listen, this is what my boss Elisha says to do. He says, go down to the Jordan River, which is the finest river in the world, as everybody knows. And why don't you go and take a dip in the river? And I want to say it was like 7 times he was supposed to go down in the river. He says, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you will be cleansed. Now, Naaman, all he had to do was go down to the river and go splash around in it 7 times. Easy peasy. I mean, it should have been done. Well, he gets a little indignant. He says, that trash heap of a river? Man, we got far better rivers where I come from. Why would I want to go to that lowly river? Why couldn't a man just speak a word and have me healed? But his servant says, well, Naaman, if he'd have asked you to do some great thing, something that was really, really hard for you to do, wouldn't you have done that? And Naaman's like, well, yeah, I'd do anything to get rid of the leprosy. He said, well, how hard is it to go down to the river and just get in the river 7 times? I mean, come on, Naaman. Naaman's like, well, maybe you're right. He said, it's worth a try anyway, right? And so Naaman goes down, goes into the river, washes 7 times like he's told, and sure enough, his leprosy is gone. Says his skin cleared up to where it was like that of a young boy. Now, we see an entire change of attitude in Naaman at this point. He goes from being indignant and unwilling to do the simple thing that Elisha says to being so grateful that he wants to pay Elisha for what he has done. He wants to give back, as it were. So he offers some silver, gold, some fine sets of clothes, and Elisha's like, nope. He says, I ain't going to take nothing from you. He said, just go in peace. Naaman then says, well, I tell you what, my boss, he makes sacrifices to these foreign gods. But man, I know that there's only one God, and that's the God of Israel. So I promise to you, Elisha, I will only sacrifice sacrifices to the God of Israel from here on out. He says, there is one time, though, you're going to have to ask your God to forgive me for this, but whenever my master, the king of Aram, goes into the temple to make the sacrifice to these foreign gods, he holds onto my arm to go in there. Now, when he kneels, Elisha, I'm going to have to kneel too, but just know in my heart, I'm not kneeling to that God. I'm only going to worship the God of Israel from now on. Elisha, in his heart, thinks that's a good thing, and he sends him away in peace. So go in peace. So Naaman starts heading on out. Meanwhile, Elisha's servant has heard all this go on. He's like, man, how could Elisha let that guy out of here without taking any of the stuff he offered? He says, you know what? Elisha might not want it, but I got me a great plan to get you some of that loot right there. So he takes off, unbeknownst to Elisha, and follows after Naaman, catches up with him, and Naaman says, hey, whoa, has something happened? Is Elisha okay? And he's like, no, Elisha's fine. He just sent me out here with a message for you. He says, I guess we could use a little bit of that loot. Maybe a couple of sets of clothes and some of the gold and stuff, and maybe a talent of that gold, I believe is what he said. And he says, well, shoot, I'll give you not one, but I'll give you 2 talents, and here's your 2 sets of clothes. Tell Elisha I said thanks. I appreciate it. So Naaman heads on back. Elisha's servant heads on back. But before he gets back to Elisha, he makes a little pit stop by his own house. He said, let me just put this stuff in my own house for safekeeping. Well, he gets back to his boss, Elisha, and Elisha says, hey, big dog, where you been? He's like, nowhere. He's like, what? You don't think that God allows me to see what's going on? He said, you don't think I saw you climb up on that chariot with Naaman and take the things that I already told him we didn't want? Yeah, well, I guess you caught me. And in return for that, Elisha says, well, I tell you what, you got one over, but God saw it. You know that leprosy that God cured Naaman of? He says, you and your family will have leprosy in your family line forever. And so his servant ends up getting leprosy. Fast forward a little bit. Elisha's hanging out with some other prophets, and these prophets say to Elisha, hey, this place where we meet with you, it's a little too crowded for us. We need to have a bigger meeting place. So let's go down to the Jordan. Each of us can cut down some poles, come back, and we'll build a bigger place for us to meet. Elisha says, why don't you go ahead and do that? Sounds good. He said, well, we really would like if you would go with us. And Elisha says, okay, I'll come down and hang out by the river with you. While they're down there, one of the prophets is using the axe to chop down some poles right on the edge of the river, and the axe head flies off the handle and lands in this river. And the guy just beside him says, oh my, what am I going to do? Elisha says, well, what's wrong? He said, well, that's not my axe head. I borrowed that axe head from Dickie, and there's going to be heck to pay if I don't give that axe head back. I don't know what I'm going to do. How am I supposed to find that axe head? Well, Elisha picks up a stick. He says, don't you worry about it. I got this. Watch this trick that I picked up one time. Takes a stick, he throws it in the river, and the axe head floats to the top. He tells the prophet, he's like, why don't you go out and get your axe head? it doesn't make sense, the story, where it's at, or anything other than the fact that it just goes to show that, this man was a man of God, that he could do miraculous things because of his calling as a prophet, as well as, his spirit, the spirit of Elijah that he got. All right, a little further on down the story. This is one of those times where the Arameans were at war with Israel. Kind of went back and forth between being friends and being enemies, kind of like frenemies, I guess. Well, this is one of the times they're at war with each other, and the Arameans come up with a battle plan, and they're secret plans. But God reveals these plans to Elisha, who then goes to the king of Israel at the time and says, "Hey, king, I got some inside knowledge here. Don't ask me where it come from. Just know that it's true." And he relays out the plans that the Arameans have for doing battle. Well, word gets back to the king of Aram and says, "You know what? Whatever we do, Israel knows what's going on." And I think it's that prophet Elisha who keeps spilling the beans. Actually, before that, the king of Aram, he gets a little upset. He's like, "Man, there's a traitor among us somewhere. There's a leak, there's a narc, there's something going on here." Like, no. Let me tell you what it is. It's that prophet Elisha. He said, "Well, one of y'all needs to go out there and catch that guy and bring him here." And so the king of Aram sends out men to capture Elisha. As the Arameans are kind of closing in on Elisha and his servant starts to get scared. He's like, Master, look, man, the army's everywhere. What are we going to do? There's just a couple of us, and there's thousands of them. What are we going to do? And Elisha says, "Man, you young pups, you little faith, you just don't know who's all on the battlefield." And this is such a powerful scripture for me, because it reminds me of what goes on beyond our conscious level of understanding. Elisha prays to God and says, "God, I want you to open the eyes of my servant, and I want you to let him see what I already see. I want him to know the spiritual beings that are fighting this war on our behalf." And so God opens the eyes of his servant, and all he sees is all these spiritual beings that are everywhere. Let's see. Let me see if I can find those. Let's see. So the prophet
opened his eyes that he may see, and the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elijah.
All around about Elisha. And so Elisha now knows it, the servant knows it, but evidently the Arameans didn't have eyes to see very well. So they come on down to capture Elisha, and Elisha prays to the Lord and says, "Hey, God, you know what would be a good thing about now? If you would strike all of these enemies stone blind, where they can't see anything." So God struck them with blindness, just as Elijah had asked. And so they're stumbling around, can't see anything. Elisha goes to him and is like, "Hey guys, I think you got the wrong road. This is not the road to the city. You're on the wrong road. Hey, let me help you out since y'all can't see. I'll lead you to the city where you tried to get to." But instead of taking him into the city where he was hiding, he takes him to Samaria, which is the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel, where the king and all the king's forces are at, the king of Israel's forces. And he hands them over to the king of Israel. Now, let's say that we are in the king's position, and our enemy has just been delivered into our hands, meek and helpless as a lamb, blind as a bat, can't do anything. Well, and we're at war with them. Our natural inclination is to wipe them out, right? Let's go ahead and just finish this off. And that's what the king wanted to do. He's like, "Elisha, please, can I kill him? Can I kill him now?" Elisha's like, "No, I don't think that we should kill him. Tell you what, instead of killing him, let's do the opposite. Let's throw him a big feast and just show him how nice we are, and then we'll send him on back home." And so that's what they end up doing. They throw him a great feast, get them all fat and happy, send them back to Aram. And when the king sees his men come back unharmed and hear of what happened to them and how they were treated well instead of killed, then the king of Aram stops his raiding into Israel. Well, a little bit later, once again, Aram and Israel are on one of their on-again fighting sprees. And the king of Aram goes down to Samaria, the capital city, and he lays siege to it, which, as you can imagine, you can't get food in or any of your other supplies in. It eventually ends up causing a great famine. One day the king's out walking, and a lady calls out to him, "King, you got to help me out, king." He's like, "Well, what's going on, lady?" He's like, "Well, me and my friend over here, we had us an agreement. I mean, we're just super hungry, king. Well, the agreement was we both have sons. The agreement was yesterday we were going to eat my son, but today we were going to eat her son. Well, guess what? We ate my son yesterday, but now today when I'm hungry again, she went and hid her son, and she's not holding up her end of the bargain." The king gets mad, as well he should. I mean, this is a gruesome, horrifying story. And guess who he blames? It's always the messenger. You're always going to shoot the messenger, right? Well, this somehow is Elisha's fault. And so he blames Elisha, and he vows to have Elisha's head cut off. The king and the messenger go to visit Elisha to carry out said plan of cutting his head off. Elisha knows what's coming, and he tells his servant, "Hey, why don't you bar that door before the king and the messenger get? Don't let him in here." So the king is hollering at him through the door, and he's like, "Elisha, we got something to discuss here." And he's like, "Man, I know you're upset with me, king, but I promise you this is all going to come to a conclusion. And by this time tomorrow, everything that we don't have that's so scarce, that is so expensive, will be sold for pennies on the dollar at the city gate tomorrow." King's like, "Now how can you promise that? I mean, the enemies out there got the city under siege. We can't get any supplies in or out." It's like, just listen. I promise God has revealed that it'll all be better by this time tomorrow. The king's officer doesn't believe the message, and Elisha reassures him again. So, "Man, I'm telling you, this is how it's going to be. But since you were such a disbeliever, you're not going to benefit at all. In fact, you'll probably end up dead before you can enjoy the benefits of what I'm telling you." Meanwhile, there are 4 lepers at the city gate. They're probably outside of the city. And they're like, "Man, I tell you what, we're kind of darned if we do, and we're darned if we don't. If we go inside the city, heck, there's nothing to eat. We're going to starve to death. If we stay out here, who knows? The Arameans might kill us." And they're like, "Well, at least the Arameans have food. Maybe we'll go over there and see if our good fortune holds out. Heck, if they kill us, they kill us. We're going to die anyway, right? But if they feed us, then, man, things will be good." So they decide to go into the Aramean camp. And when they get there, lo and behold, the camp is deserted. They ain't a soldier to be found. And the reason behind this is because, unbeknownst to everybody, God had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of a great army, chariots and horsemen and all this, scared the bejesus out of the Arameans, and they took off, left everything behind, just took off running. And so the lepers go through, and they're like, "Man, look at all this." So they ate a little bit until they got their tummies full, and they're like, "Hey, you know what? There's some gold and silver around here." So they take it and they go out and hide it. They come back, grab some more, and go and hide it. And finally, they're getting ready to get the 3rd trip of loot. They're like, "Well, we probably better go and tell somebody inside the city, because if they find out that we've known all this time and we didn't tell them, things probably go bad for us." So they go in and they report the news to the Israelites in Samaria, but the king thinks it's a trap. Wise king. He's like, maybe they just withdrew from the city as a trap, and they're waiting for us to go into their camp, and then they're going to jump out of hiding and kill us. Instead, they send out a search party, a scout party, and they go and check the camp. Camp's empty, and they start on down the road. And all they see along the road is stuff that the Arameans have cast off that's slowing them down. They're so scared of this phantom army that they're just chucking their stuff alongside the road and running. The scout party comes back. They confirm the good news. The Samaritans go out, raid the camp, plenty of food and everything out there, which fulfills what Elijah said the day before. He says there's going to be so much in abundance that it's just going to be dirt cheap. Well, in their haste to go raid that camp, the king's officer, the one that didn't believe Elisha, ends up getting trampled to death, which also fulfills what Elisha said, like, look, since you didn't believe, you're not going to live to see the benefits of this.
Yep.
All right, chapter 8. You remember that Shunammite lady that Elijah was such a good friend of? The one that put him together a sleeping place in the upper room. The one that he brought her son back to life. Now Elisha, let's see. Elisha told her that there was a famine coming and that she needed to flee and go to a place where it would be better suited for her and her son. And she does that. But after the famine's over, when she returns, because she had abandoned her land, the king had taken possession of it. Meanwhile, Elisha's servant is telling the king, unrelated, just happens to be telling the king a story about the time that Elisha brought her son back to life. All of a sudden, he looks up and there's this woman. He's like, there she is right there, king. The lady I'm telling you about, that's her right there. Well, the king then, he is so moved by the story that not only does he restore her land to her possession, but he also gives her all the income that the land would have made, even for the whole time that she was gone, even up to the present time. Meanwhile, Elisha goes up to Damascus, which was, it was a town in Aram. And there was a guy named Ben-Hadad who was the king. He was sick. He was old. He was sick. Somebody tells the king, hey, the man of God has come all the way up here. So he says to Hazael, take a gift with you and go out and meet the man of God. Consult the Lord through him and ask him. And says, hey, prophet, is Ben-Hadad going to live or is he going to die? So Hazael goes out to meet him, takes some gifts, and then he asks the question. He says, will Ben-Hadad recover from his illness or is he going to die? And Elisha says, you go back and you tell Ben-Hadad that he will. He said, but I got bad news. He will recover from his illness, but he is going to die. And Hazael, you're the guy that's going to do it. Elisha then starts to cry, and Hazael asks, well, why are you crying? He says, because it pains me to tell you this. You're going to become king after you kill Ben-Hadad, and it's going to spell trouble for Israel. I hate to announce the fact that you're going to be king of Aram, because I know that it means trouble for my people later on. And Hazael's like, what? Little old me? I'm going to cause all that kind of trouble? He's like, nah, I think you got the wrong guy. Elisha says, no, I don't think so. Well, Hazael goes back, tells Ben-Hadad, says, great news, king. The man of God says you're going to recover. Ben-Hadad says, oh, that's great news, man. That's awesome. Well, within a couple of days, Hazael takes a towel, soaks it with water, puts it over the king's face, and smothers him dead right there, thus fulfilling what Elisha said was going to happen.
That'd be the original waterboarding.
That's right. Well, and so Hazael then succeeds Ben-Hadad as the king. Meanwhile, over in Israel, not Israel, Judah. Now we're going to start doing some flip-flopping, and I'll tell you when we're going to be going from the northern kingdom, which is the kingdom of Israel, to the southern kingdom, which is the kingdom of Judah. The writers here in 2 Kings, they kind of flip-flop back and forth between these kings, kind of give you a running account of who's king at the time and what's kind of going on during their reign. So we're going to go down to the southern kingdom of Judah. Elisha sends a prophet to go anoint a guy named Jehu king. Now, there is a king of Judah already. His name is Ahaziah. Ahaziah is still up in the town of Jezreel, up in the northern kingdom. He is visiting Joram, who is the king of Israel at the time. So Joram is the northern king. Ahaziah is the southern king. But they're both together in one town, visiting each other. Joram goes down to meet Jehu, and basically he gets shot in the back. He gets shot in the back, I believe, by somebody with an arrow. And then he was thrown into the field that was owned by Nabob. And there's a reason for that, is because, let's see, I'm trying to remember what the... Let's see, coming broke through. Here we go. I'm in the wrong chapter, that's why I couldn't find it. Okay, cut off, and they opened the door and ran. Jehu went out, so is everything all right? Gosh, I moved further than I thought.
Yeah, left half of the 8th chapter out. I was getting confused.
Wait a second. Oh yeah, I did leave that half. Okay, I'm sorry, let's go back. So Jehoram becomes king of Judah, the southern kingdom. I left out a whole chunk here. Sorry about that. He becomes king of Judah, the southern kingdom, and he does evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, not many of the southern kingdom kings are described as doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, but he is one of them. Now, Amaziah becomes king of Judah. He rules for 1 year and also does evil in the eyes of the Lord. So he goes to war against Aram with the northern king, Joram. King Joram gets injured, retreats to the town of Jezreel to recuperate, and King Ahaziah goes to Jezreel to see King Joram. So that brings us up through chapter, all the way through 8. Meanwhile, Jehu is anointed by Elisha, or Elisha's representative, to become king. So at this point now we've got 2 kings, and we can't have 2 kings in the southern kingdom, right? One of them's got to go. So while Jehu is down in up in Jezreel, Joram goes to meet him. Or Jehu goes up to meet him. Joram goes out, gets shot in the back. He gets thrown down in Nabob's field. Meanwhile, Ahaziah, who is the co-king at this point of the southern kingdom, he turns tail and runs. During his escape, he ends up getting wounded, but he escapes to this town called Megiddo, and he ends up dying there. So now we've fixed the problem of having 2 kings. Basically, he's assassinated. Both the northern king and the southern king are assassinated at this point, and Jehu takes his place on the throne, which God has anointed him for. Now, I know last week we heard about old Queen Jezebel and how the prophet had claimed that she's going to get hers. In fact, said that the dogs were going to eat her flesh in the street. There wasn't even going to be enough of her to bury. Well, she's still alive and kicking for right now. But old King Jehu, which is the northern king, he goes back to Jezreel. And Jezebel's eunuch, I'm sorry, Jehu. He's the king, the northern king. Jehu goes back there. Her eunuchs pick her up and chuck her out the window to the street below, which of course results in her untimely demise. Jehu tells somebody to go out, gather her up, and go bury her. But when they go out there to do it, there ain't nothing left except for a skull, and I think it says a couple of hands, right? Her hands and her skull are still there, and her feet. So they go back and tell Jehu, and he says, you know what? This is what God meant when he spoke through the prophet Elijah, that on the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh. And so that fulfilled the prophecy. So she meets her untimely end a little bit later than her husband did, but she still dies and prophecy is fulfilled just the same. All right, in chapter 10, now although King Ahab is dead, remember God had proclaimed that all of his family would be wiped out. Well, he had 70 sons in the city of Samaria. Jehu tells the elders and the guardians to appoint a king. At this point, I don't think everybody knows he's king yet, or maybe he's not accepted as the king. Well, he tells the elders and the guardians there to appoint a king and fight. And said, let's get this figured out. Well, they refuse to fight. They refuse to appoint a new leader, and they offer to do whatever he says. He says, all right, then here's what I want you to do. I want you to take the heads of those 70 sons of Ahab, and I want you to have them brought to me down in Jezreel. And so what they did is they killed all 70 of Ahab's sons, and they brought their heads down in baskets to the city of Jezreel to prove to Jehu that they were dead. Meanwhile, Jehu kills the rest of Ahab's family who was hiding out in Jezreel, but not only the rest of Ahab's family, he kills all of Ahab's chief men, all of his close friends, and his priests. I mean, this guy is leaving nothing to chance. He is killing everybody that is associated at this point with Ahab. In all, Jehu kills 42, I'm sorry, there's no number there. Then he goes on to kill 42 relatives of Ahaziah's, which was the southern king, of his relatives as well. Well, Jehu goes out and he meets a guy named Jehonadab, and they go up to Samaria. But when they meet, he says, "Are you of the same mind as I am?" And Jehonadab says, "You darn right I am." And he says, "All right, then climb up in my chariot. We've got some work to do." So they load up and they go to Samaria, and they end up killing all the rest of Ahab's family. I can't imagine that Ahab has any family left, but they find some more, and they end up killing the rest of Ahab's family according to Elijah's prophecy. Now at this time, remember Ahab and Jezebel, they didn't worship the God of Israel. They did evil in the eyes of the Lord. What they did was they worshiped the god Baal. You remember that little contest that they had between Elijah and the prophets of Baal? Well, there's still some prophets of Baal here. And so Jehu goes in, he says, "I tell you what, guys, old King Ahab served Baal just a little bit." He said, "But I will serve Baal much." Well, all he was just tricking them. He was trying to get them all together. And so he says, "I tell you what, I really want to worship Baal, but we got to do this right. So bring all the ministers of Baal together." And so they come, and he says, "All right, get them all in the temple. Get them in there." He said, "We're going to offer some sacrifices." He said, "Man, why don't you get these guys some cloaks out of the royal wardrobe?" So get some cloaks, gets them all in the temple. And then he tells the guards, he's like, "All right, anybody comes out of the temple, you kill them. If they get by you, it's your life for their life. I'm serious. I want every last one of them dead." So he has every last one of them killed. Then he has the temple torn down, brings out the sacred stone that they used as part of their worship to Baal, and they destroy the sacred stone. And then one last fitting jab of the thumb in the eye, it says that the Israelites then used that area for a porta potty. They used it as a toilet. So God is pleased with what he sees, and he promises to reward Jehu's descendants forevermore. And that seems to be a design motif that when a ruler really does things right, God will promise to reward that ruler's lineage on down the road. And I'm just thankful that he chooses to reward families generationally, but he doesn't necessarily always hold us responsible by cursing us generationally. So that means, you know, if Dickie and Diane, I mean, you've done a great job worshiping God, and God's going to bless your sons and their sons and their sons, and, you know, on down the line. But if you messed up and did evil in the eyes of the Lord, doesn't always necessarily mean that your children would be cursed because of that. They would have a chance, not always, but most times, they have a chance to stand on their own 2 feet and choose for themselves whether they wanted to do right by God or to do evil as in the eyes of the Lord. Meanwhile, Hazael, which is now the king of Aram since he killed Ben-Hadad in his sleep, he begins raiding Israel and stealing territory, picking off towns and picking off areas. And then Jehu dies, and Jehoahaz succeeds him as king of Israel. Now, time to jump from Israel in the north down to Judah in the south. There is a lady named Athaliah. She was the mother of Ahaziah, who was basically assassinated while he was visiting his good buddy up in the northern kingdom. Well, she was so upset when she found out her son was dead that she proceeds to destroy the whole royal family. She is going through and just killing everybody. Now there is one of the royal children named Joash who is saved by his sister. His sister takes him and hides him and his nurse in a little room to where Athaliah can't get to him and kill him. He grows up, and when he becomes 7 years old, he is crowned the king of Judah. Now, once again, there's already a king. Actually, there's not a king. His mother is kind of ruling in place of a king at this point. But when he is 7, he's crowned king. Now, she hears the shout from everybody that goes up when Joash is crowned. And she goes, I wonder what all that commotion's about. So she goes, she lays eyes on the boy who she thinks he's dead because all the male descendants are supposed to be killed. And she cries out, traitors, traitors, what have you done here to me? And then she is put to death at the behest of the priests. And then Joash is free to begin his reign as the king of the southern kingdom of Judah. I can only imagine what it'd be like as a 7-year-old boy to be thrust into that position, to see, and I'm not sure whether Athaliah was his mom or his aunt or his grandmother. She was definitely part of his family, but you see this woman in your family just killing everybody in your family, then you see her put to death, and you've got a crown put on your head, a royal robe put around your shoulders, and everybody, long live King Joash. And how at 7 years old, how profound that must have been for him. I don't know, let's see, in the 7th year of Joseph became king, he reigns in Jerusalem for 40 years. Okay, obviously this lady is not his mother because it tells us in chapter 12, his mother's name was Zibiah. He does right. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years that Jehoiada, the priest, instructed him. So this is a common thing we're going to see through the rest of Kings and through the Chronicles is the northern kings do evil in the eyes of the Lord. That's why they fall to the exile. They're exiled much earlier than the southern kingdom. For the longest time, most of the southern kingdom did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And this is, Joash is the first of this. He did not, however, go out and destroy the high places. So people were still making sacrifices up in the high places. But for the most part, God was happy with this young man. Now, he looks around one day at the royal temple, or not the royal temple, God's temple. He looks and says, man, this place has really fallen into disrepair. It's been a while since we did a little work on this place. And so he makes plans to have the temple repaired. They come up with a plan to finance the repairs. The money comes in, and the priests are supposed to make the repairs as soon as the money's there. Well, they got the money, except the priests don't fix up the temple. A little while later, Joash comes back and says, hey, priests, didn't we already raise the money to fix the temple? Well, yes, boss, we did. How come the temple's not finished? Well, you can imagine, got their head hung down and they're kicking the dirt, kind of like a good contractor does when you call them out because they haven't got your bathroom renovated yet. And he's like, you know what, maybe maybe I didn't make myself clear. I want this thing done, and you're not getting it done, so we're going to farm the work out. So he decides to put somebody else in charge of fixing up the temple. Finally, the work starts getting done, and the money that's coming to the treasury for this, they use that money to pay the subcontractors to make sure the work gets done. And that's a good thing. Well, while this is going on, our old friend Hazael from Aram shows back up in the area. He's still picking off the territories around the southern kingdom now. He attacks Gath, which is what used to be in Philistia. That's where Goliath, the Philistine, came from before David killed him. Well, he attacks Gath, and he says, you know what? Jerusalem's right down the road. Let's go on a little field trip, boys. Let's go take Jerusalem while we're down here. So he's coming for Jerusalem. Joash kind of sees the handwriting on the wall, makes a decision that I'm sure a lot of people didn't agree with. He says, you know, rather than go out and fight this guy, how about if we just take all the sacred temple objects, all the gold, and we'll just give it to him, and maybe he'll just leave us alone. And so he does that, and King Hazael, he takes the loot, and he decides to leave Jerusalem unharmed, and he goes back home. Then not too long after that, Joash is assassinated by his own officials, and his son Amaziah succeeds him as king of the southern kingdom. Now, chapter 13. We jump from the southern kingdom back up to the northern kingdom of Israel. Jehu's son, Jehoahaz, becomes king of Israel after his father died. He reigns 17 years, and guess what he does in the eyes of the Lord? Man does evil in the eyes of the Lord. Because he does evil in the eyes of the Lord, God's anger burns against the Israelites, and he lets King Hazael and the Arameans come in and oppress Israel. Now, at some point, this evil king, Jehoahaz, understands that he's messed up and he needs to turn his heart back to God. So he seeks God's favor. God listens to him, and as God often does, God says, all right, you know what? I hear you. I'm going to ease up a little bit on you. And so God ends up delivering Israel from the hand of the Arameans, but them stiff-necked, hard-hearted Israelites didn't change their ways. They just kept on sinning. Well, God allows Jehoahaz's army to be decimated, and then he ends up dying, and his son Jehoash succeeds him as king of the northern kingdom of Israel. So, good King Jehoash reigns for 16 years, and once again does evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, it gets a little confusing here because let's see. Right after we're introduced to him and told that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord and what he did, the author of 2 Kings goes right and says, as for the other events that he did, aren't they all written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel? Then he dies, and his son Jeroboam succeeds him. And I was like, okay, Jeroboam. And then, but the story goes on, but the story goes back to tell you what Jehoash does. So he tells us he dies, but before he died, here's what he did. And so here's what he did. He goes to see the prophet Elisha because he hears that Elisha's sick and he's dying. And he goes in and he says, "Oh, Elisha, man, I'm so sorry to hear you're sick, you're dying. And by the way, boy, my kingdom is in a mess. My army is decimated. You know, the one I inherited from my dad. What am I going to do?" Elisha says, "I tell you what, grab that bow and arrow right there." He says, "Put my hand on yours and point the arrow out that window to the east right there." He said, "All right, let the arrow fly." And the king does, and he says, "You know what? That is the arrow, what did they call it? The arrow of..."
Deliverance.
Of what?
Deliverance?
The arrow of deliverance, that's it. I was trying to, arrow of deliverance. Surely you will beat the Arameans. And he says, here's what I want you to do. Grab that quiver of arrows right there, grab a handful of arrows and strike the ground with it. And so the king strikes the ground over and over. He does it 3 times, and then he stops. And Elisha gets mad at him. He's like, what did you stop for? I don't know. He says, well, I tell you what, if you would have struck it 5 or 6 times, surely you would have defeated the Arameans once and for all. But because you stopped at 3 and didn't complete the task, which he didn't tell him how many times to strike the ground, so I mean, how's this guy supposed to know how many times he's supposed to hit the ground? He said, but since you only did it 3 times, God will only deliver the Aramean into your hand 3 times. You'll only defeat them 3 times, and then they're going to defeat you. After that, Elisha ends up dying, and he's put in his tomb. Shortly after he is put in his tomb, the Moabites, who are Israelite enemies on the eastern side of the Jordan River, they are starting to send raiding parties into Israel. And whenever they would come, they brought, death and destruction and mayhem. Well, there's this couple of guys out there burying a man over near Elisha's tomb. They see the Moabites coming in, and they're like, oh, we ain't got time to finish digging this grave and bury this guy. Let's just chuck him in this hole over here, which just happened to be Elisha's tomb. So they chucked the dead guy into Elisha's tomb, and when he hit Elisha's bones, he come back to life and stood up. I mean, that's how much power Elisha still had. Even in his dead bones, there was power. Which, to me, folks, and it might be a tenuous connection, but you remember Elijah, a story about a valley of dead bones? And God tells Elisha, speak to those bones and prophesy to them, prophet Elijah. And those bones came to life. And now here we have Elijah's successor, who is his dry dead bones can even impart life. I think there's probably a connection between those two. I just thought it was kind of interesting. The king of Aram, King Hazael, continues to oppress Israel, and God allows Jehoash, which is the northern king, to win 3 times. Then he ends up dying in the second time that we're told that he died in this chapter. And his son Jeroboam succeeds him. All right, back south. We'll head back south to Judah. Amaziah is the king of Judah. He reigned 29 years as the king of Judah, the southern king, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Now remember, his dad was murdered by his own officials, and so his first act as the new king of Judah is to kill all the officials that had anything to do with his dad's assassination. But, the Bible tells us, he stopped short at just the officials. He did not wipe out the officials' families. And the author here kind of whispers on our ear and says, by the way, dear reader, this is to fulfill what God said, that parents should not be put to death for the sins of their children, and children should not be put to death for the sins of their father. Real quick side note, don't want to be political, but man, don't you think that the prosecuting attorney up in the Midwest, where that kid just killed 4 people in that school, they ought to be reading this before they go and try charging the mom and the dad with involuntary manslaughter just because their kid did something stupid. I understand why they're doing it, but hey, maybe need to get back to the Bible a little bit before they make such a rash decision. So he executes the officials who murdered his father. He goes out and has a great victory over the Edomites, who are causing him great distress. Now the Edomites, they weren't a very strong fighting force. So I mean, they were just crushed by the Israelites from the southern kingdom of Judah. Well, ain't nothing like kicking the snot out of a lesser opponent to just really get your ego going, right? I mean, after all, that's why Carolina, Clemson, all these major schools will schedule some poor little old Division II school to start the season off and just kick the snot out of them to get their ego going and head into some tougher battles. Well, that's what happened here. They kicked the snot out of the Edomites, and then King then King Amaziah issues a challenge to his counterpart up in the northern kingdom of Israel. And he challenges old Jehoash to a throwdown. He says, let's get this thing going. Now, the northern king is like, look, man, you guys are just two piddly tribes down in the south. He said, man, I got all these people up here. Basically, he says, a thistle dares to challenge a mighty cedar. He said, look here, you young pup. Don't get too big for your britches. Yeah, you might have beat the Edomites, but they ain't nothing like us. You might just wipe the snot off your nose, get the wet from behind your ears, and stay down there, and no need for you to come up here and get your tail whipped. Well, Amaziah doesn't listen, so Jehoash comes down, kicks the snot out of the little upstart, attacks and captures him. Then Jehoash goes and destroys one of the walls in Jerusalem, goes in, ransacks the temple and the palace, takes some hostages, and then goes back up home to Samaria. He says, I told you, you should have just let the sleeping dog lie. Jehoash, the king of the northern kingdom, he dies, and his son Jeroboam succeeds him. Amaziah ends up living another 15 years after Jehoash's death, and then he too, like his father before him, is assassinated. And then his 16-year-old son, Azariah, ends up being made king of Judah. All right, so now we'll jump back up to the northern kingdom and we'll wrap it up for tonight. Jehoash dies, and his son Jeroboam, which is actually the second Jeroboam to be king, and you'll have to pardon me because I didn't go back and count the generations. It's either his grandfather or great-grandfather, maybe great-great-grandfather, Jehoash the first, Jeroboam the first. So this is Jeroboam the second. He ends up reigning 41 years, and lo and behold, he's a northern king, so you know he had to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did, however, do some good things. He reclaimed some of the land that Israel had lost over the years to their neighbors. God sees Israel's suffering, and he ends up having a soft spot for him, and he eases that suffering through some of the work that Jeroboam II had done. But at the end of the day, Jeroboam II dies, and then his son Zechariah succeeds him as the king of the northern king of Israel. All right, that takes us through chapter 14. We took a big chunk out of 2 Kings there, about 10 chapters tonight. But as you see, we're in a pretty steady pattern now, flipping back and forth between northern kingdom, southern kingdom, northern kingdom, southern kingdom, and kind of getting the highlights of what each king's doing. And we're in a pretty predictable pattern where the kings of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, are going to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. They're going to suffer at the hand of God through his earthly instruments, such as the Arameans and such. Whereas in the southern kingdom, those kings right now are doing what's right in the eyes of the Lord. And we see the associated blessings that come with that. And of course, in the northern kingdom, we see the associated curses that come from that. So once again, we see a lot of mayhem and killing and assassinating and smothering and dogs eating up carcasses and even using a temple for a toilet. I mean, I'm guessing that was the worst insult that they could have done to the temple of Baal was to take a dump in it. It's your crap.
They were unhappy with it.
Yeah. So, what do you think? You guys got any insights about the path we traveled tonight? Any thoughts, questions? Too bad we don't have Paula here. I mean, she was really...
Seems like the northern people just can't seem to get it right ever.
No. And here's a spoiler alert. They're going to go into exile. God is going to allow the Assyrians to take them into exile, defeat them, I don't know, 100, 150 years or so, plus or minus a little bit, before the southern kingdom, and they never come back from exile. They're called the Lost 10 Tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom will hold out another 100, 150 years till they go into exile, but God always promises them, and we talked a little bit about that No, actually we haven't, I'm sorry. When we get into the prophets, the book of the prophets, Jeremiah, Daniel, and all that, you'll see that God continually promises the southern kingdom that goes into exile, that their exile will only be temporary and that God will bring them back. The northern kingdom is given no such assurance, and even to this day, once they went into exile, they were scattered, and that was the end of that.
So it's because they continually fail to do what they're supposed to do?
I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption. Yeah.
But I mean, it seems like the southern side is not quite perfect, but
Not yet.
not.
I mean, they're doing a pretty good job, but they haven't messed up too bad yet. But you wait, their time's coming. We'll get to them in a little bit. So, all right. Any other thoughts? Man, another great storytelling session. Go in peace, and we will not be meeting next week because of the dinner. Although it might be a good time to have a captive audience. But I'm going to be too busy stuffing my face to talk. So we'll take a break next week, and then we'll get back after it the week after. Go in peace, my friends. God bless y'all.
Thank you.
Hey folks, remember to click the subscribe button below and ring the bell to be notified when we post new content. And as always, if today's video touched you in some way, please hit the thumbs up button and leave us a comment. We love to hear how our content impacts your walk with Jesus Christ. Until next time, God bless.